Pirates, ninjas, Vikings, come along with me as I build my drum sander and point out all the mistakes I make along the way, so you can learn from everything that I mess up. Now, the first question is, why build a drum sander? Well, for me, I wanted to make thin pieces of wood that you couldn't get from the hobby store. Those are limited to basswood and balsa, but I'd want to make something else. And a drum sander is perfect for making thin pieces of wood. First, I'm working in the drum, and this is my doorknob hole saw. Since I'm making a small drum sander, the 2 1/8 inch hole saw seems to be about the right size. However, the first thing I would change is to drill out the center hole so it's a 3/8 inch hole. A 1/4 inch threaded rod seems kind of easy to bend. A 3/8 inch rod would be sturdier, and the bearings that it rides in also spin better. I'm clamping my drum together with nuts and washers. Once the glue dries, it'll be solid. And clean up your gluey mess. Now for the base, I'm gluing and screwing these 2 cleats in that would give my riser block something to track through. Great idea here by using a parallel board, this white melamine board, to keep my cleats parallel. Now the cleats that go on the end, don't glue those down. You see, immediately I had to unscrew this so I could drill a hole through the cleat. And then I remembered to drill a hole through the back cleat. But again, don't glue these down. Screws are just fine. You're going to have to unscrew them later. And maybe screw them in from the bottom. When putting in your hinges, I like to put 1 screw in each hinge flap and make sure that when you fold it up, everything's lined up properly before committing to put in all of the screws. And then I'm drilling a hole for my axle and then countersinking another hole for the bearings. They just get pushed in and have a friction fit. Now, do you see the mistake I'm making here? I'm installing the drum in the 2 sides. But I got to get the ramp installed underneath the drum before it all comes together. To hold my drill in place, I'm using this plywood pinch block. And because the neck of my drill is slightly smaller than the hole I drilled, I have to wrap it in tape to make the neck slightly thicker. And then it goes in the pinching piece of plywood, and the chuck is attached to the threaded rod. And even with everything lined up the best I could, it still sounds noisy. So my riser block has a couple of angles cut into it, and it's smoothed out on the belt sander, so it kind of looks like that. And then I'm cutting it to fit exactly between the cleats. It's wide enough so it won't bind. Now I'm using another 1/4 inch threaded rod to move the riser block. So I thought drilling a 1/4 inch hole would be just fine. And I'm using this threaded insert to hold onto the threaded rod. And of course, this presented some problems. I tried to get the threaded rod to go through, and it kept bumping into the sides of the 1/4 inch hole I drilled. So I went back and drilled the hole bigger. and that didn't help. And then I realized that my threaded insert was actually in at an angle. So as the threaded rod went in, it immediately hit the sides of the hole. So I replaced it with this 1/4-inch T-nut, and that screw is there to keep the T-nut from falling out. And I'm using these lock nuts. They have a nylon insert that holds onto the threaded rod so they don't become loose. In dealing with the threaded rod, you don't want to use pliers because you'll crush the threads. So I have 2 nuts sandwiched together around this washer, and when I tighten them down, they're tight enough that I can use a crescent wrench to hold onto it and keep the rod from spinning. Now I'm looking to keep the threaded rod from shifting, so I'm going to sandwich the back cleat between 2 lock nuts. The trick I found is to put a lock nut onto the threaded rod and tighten it down until the threads come out the other side. Take off the nut, and now your nylon insert has some, we'll just call them threads, from the rod. I find this easier to get a nylon nut on backwards. And I can use a drill to power through the 12 inches of threaded rod through my T-nut, so I can slip my riser block into the cleats, after slightly enlarging those holes I drilled earlier. Now on this end, I'm going to attach a knob using lock nuts. And when I spin the knob, the threaded rod spins and the riser block goes back and forth, which raises the ramp, which changes the distance between the drum and the table. So now I can sand the drum smooth with a piece of sandpaper attached to a piece of wood. And to measure the angle I need to cut on the sandpaper, I wrap it around the drum so that one side reaches the other side, and make that mark. Then cut my sandpaper. And then I wrap it around to figure out how long it needs to be. And using that same offcut, I can cut another angle. And this is adhesive back sandpaper, so it just sticks right on the drum. So now it's time to see if this works. If I crank up the ramp till the board just touches the sandpaper, and what do you know? It kind of works. Now I ended up using 120 grit sandpaper. What I should have used was 80 grit or something even coarser. I was hoping that the drum sander would get me to the correct thickness quicker, but 120 is more of a finishing grade sandpaper. Something a little more coarser would get me down to the correct thickness quicker. And did you notice my next mistake? You see the way I'm pushing the board in? With the way the drum is spinning, if I'm not holding on tight enough, it'll just catch the board and send it on through. That traveled halfway across the shop. And as we're looking at this problem, we're completely ignoring this one. That exposed piece of threaded rod will grab hold of something, and that's gonna hurt. So let's take care of that right now. And so with the board going against the direction of the drum, and my body not in the way in case it wants to shoot off again, it turns out nice and smooth. It actually worked. But let me show you a few other problems I've noticed. With the way the ramp is set up, the board will run into the work table. And this knob, the knob actually hits the work surface as well. So right now it gets operated hanging off the side of the work table. So as you're designing your drum sander, hopefully you can find a better way of dealing with this. And so let's give it a try for what it was actually meant to do. I'm going to resaw this board through the bandsaw, and of course it's going to give me a rough edge. So then I have to raise the ramp until the board actually starts sanding. And then I can feed the whole board through the correct way. And repeat and repeat. And again, if it was 80 grit, I can get it smoother faster and then use a random orbit sander to make it extra smooth. But this drum sander does the job. So in conclusion, I built a drum sander, and it works. And it's got some problems. So now that you see my issues, you can figure out a better way to make one of these. And if you do, you should let me know, because I would love to see what you come up with.